Dear listener, querido Radio Escucha, are you planning to vote in the upcoming midterm elections? We at Futuro want to hear from you. Would you consider leaving us a voice message answering this simple question? What is moving you to vote? Also, tell us which party or candidate you think will better address your concerns. Call us at 646-571-1224. Again, 646-571-1224. Dial us up on a rotary phone. Also, be sure to include your name and contact information in case we want to follow up with you. And thanks a lot. Gracias.
From Futuro Media and PRX, it's Latino Rebels Radio. I am your host, Julio Ricardo Varela, and here we are, the first week of November and the week before the midterms in the United States. But for all you political geeks out there, especially political geeks who follow Latin America, the big news out of Brazil on Sunday and sort of the reaction to that was the election of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, former president of Brazil, will be the next president of Brazil because he defeated incumbent right-wing President Jair Bolsonaro. So that happened. And just a reminder, everybody, a little disclosure, we do all this remotely. So you might have some sounds of the city like DC or Boston where I record out of, just to let you know. So I'm like, I need to go talk to someone who is closer to this, who's been following it, who's going to give me fabulous insight. And my producer, Oscar Fernandez, and editorial director, Fernanda Santos, found someone. Fabulous guest out of Washington, D.C. Welcome to Latino Rebels Radio. Please introduce yourself, what you do, and why you get to talk about Brazil.
Hi, Julio. Well, thank you so much for having me, first of all. My name is Roberta Braga. I am Director of Counter-Disinformation Strategies at Equis, where we are absolutely monitoring narratives around the U.S. midterms here in the U.S. next week. But I am here to talk about Brazil because I'm actually Brazilian. I've been in the United States for over 20 years, but during that time, I've actually worked at the intersection of U.S. and Brazil politics and elections for a while. Before joining Equis, I spent 5 years at the Atlantic Council, where I was doing foreign policy, U.S. Latin America, with a focus on Brazil, and where I also focused on monitoring disinformation related to the Brazilian elections in 2018.
Ooh.
So I'm definitely following everything pretty closely, both from the personal and the professional side.
Well, I think you're the perfect guest for us, and thank you for being on with us. Because even though I am a Latin Americanist, I am not Brazilian, but I have been following it for years. Latino Rebels does cover Brazil in a lot of ways, and it's something that is important to us because of its place, not only in Latin America, but also here in the United States. I mean, I live in Massachusetts, so you go to Framingham, it's like little Brazil, right? So for me, the community of Massachusetts up here has always been here. It's always been active. I've always talked about Brazilian politics. So with that said, Roberta, what are the big takeaways from this week for someone who's not Brazilian to kind of, or who follows this and wants to know a little bit more to understand it as to how significant the last couple of days have been out of Brazil?
Sure. Well, I can definitely talk about this forever, but I will focus on a couple of points. The first one really being that, much like here in the United States, polarization in Brazil has increased vastly over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years. We've never, as a country, been more divided in Brazil. But I think these elections really showed that Brazilian institutions and our voting systems can withstand pressure, can withstand criticism, and there was a lot. The elections were conducted in a free and fair manner with, some concerning efforts to suppress voters, isolated instances on the day of, but no mass interruptions at scale. And because we have an electronic voting system in Brazil, the results were officially announced Sunday evening, only hours after the polls had closed. And moments after those were announced, we saw world leaders kind of jumping in to congratulate Lula. And 3 days in, the majority of Brazilians are absolutely supportive of the results, and we've seen Bolsonaro's leadership team and a lot of different political leaders who did support him also speaking out in support of the results. So yes, we're seeing, as we saw in the US, some pushback, some mobilization, some protesting, but overall, these were, very well conducted elections, and the results are strong, and our democracy stands. So I am happy.
Well, this is really important because, not to look at it from this notion that the system in Brazil, even being a young democracy, right? I mean, since 85, right? We're this a pretty young democracy, that you're saying that the system held, even with someone like Bolsonaro who really pushed it to extremes, right? Or am I wrong? I mean, tell me more about the system and we could talk a little bit more about Lula and Bolsonaro and all that, but just talk to me about democracy in Brazil, like a sigh of relief. That's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Brazilian democracy, I would say, we're young, but we're a strong democracy. We use electronic voting machines that we've used for 2 decades now, very reputable. The electoral court and a lot of different actors have, proven time and time again that the system is very reputable. And so, even though we did see President Bolsonaro kind of throwing doubt behind the system, really talking about electoral fraud, much in the same way that we saw Donald Trump talking about mail-in ballots here in the US. Ultimately, the system did its job. I would say it's almost like the biggest winner of the election.
Ah, look at you. You sound like you sound a little bit relieved. But tell me about Bolsonaro, like like in the last couple of days, where for a couple of days it's like, oh, is he going to say anything? I mean, I saw some of the footage where it's I mean, I love Brazilian media. Sorry, I just love it. They're the polarization. I get it, but they're trying to follow him, and he's turning off the lights, and he's not going to talk today. And then he kind of talks on Tuesday, not really conceding, but respecting the Constitution. And then supposedly he talks with members of the Supreme Court, and the transition team says, yes, he lost. Are you surprised? Are you skeptical of Bolsonaro? Are you surprised? What do you think is the general mood about that?
I mean, his actions really were right in line with the things that he's been saying and doing over the past 4 years, frankly. And for anyone that was following the 2020 elections here, this comes right out of the Trump playbook. So I'm not surprised per se. I am relieved that he stood by the Constitution. Now, his speech, 2 minutes long, it was a concession speech that didn't actually include a concession. Instead, he kind of struck the tone, again, very similar to the one we saw with Donald Trump taking around January 6th. He essentially justified the protests and movements by saying they are a result of what he called indignation with the process and a feeling of injustice in relation to the outcome. And even though he did say that peaceful protests are always welcome, quote unquote, he essentially excused, his supporters' more egregious behavior by not calling for an end to the blockades and other demonstrations on the streets. So I think he was essentially, nodding to his base while half-heartedly fulfilling his duty to speak out, following the laws. And he wrapped up by saying, I've always been framed as an anti democratic leader by my opponents, but I've always played within the lines of the Constitution. And I think he was essentially trying to kind of speak to his base while also addressing a broader crowd of voters. And so that has an effect, which I can go more into.
Yeah, it does have an effect, but I want you to go more into that. But just to put a final button on what Bolsonaro said, and then we can go into the effect, and then we have to talk about Lula. And you are mentioning some of these protests. There was, by Monday night, I'm quoting the BBC, there were 342 such incidents. This is the Federal Highway Police reporting about these protests. A lot of these, like truckers, right? Their blockages, stopping just traffic, stopping commerce. You know what I mean? Like that was happening, but things were later cleared, according to the BBC. But I guess my question, does this leave an opening to Bolsonaro because it wasn't so, I play within the Constitution, but I guess my question is, how have his comments played with his supporters? And maybe it does get to the question of what you want to get into the effects of going beyond his supporters. So are people kind of like right now, okay, that's fine, democracy, transition, we're out of here? Or is he just waiting to see if this intensifies? Man, it took me a while to explain that, Roberta. I'm very sorry.
Brazil is a complicated country.
As I was talking, I was like, what the hell am I saying?
It's not for beginners. We always joke about that.
Okay, all right. Please, I know it was complex the way I explained it. I know you'll break it down much better than me, so take it away.
No, so you started off our conversation today by saying that he did speak with justices of the Supreme Court. So he did reportedly admit to them, it's over. His chief of staff yesterday, after his speech, did say we're going to respect the transition process according to the law. But in his address to the public, with this sort of strategically ambiguous, I guess you could say, tone, we do see that kind of speaking directly to his base. On Telegram, on WhatsApp, and in the protests on the street, we are seeing some calls for military intervention, for the military to take charge, calls for Congress and the Supreme Court to be disbanded, and for the president essentially to remain in office. And I think we'll continue to see these electoral fraud narratives circulating again, much like how we see it still to this day here in the US. But at least in the shortest term, we do see that the road blockades are being lifted. You mentioned some numbers earlier. I saw an article from The Guardian saying that the Brazilian Federal Highway Police confirmed they're down to about 160 barricades, which is a number down from around 500 on Monday. So we're seeing this dissipating slowly. But yeah, his movement is not going away. And I think his most ardent supporters will continue to be angry, to push back against Lula. Lula has a fraught history of his own, so I think there's a lot of sort of hatred and emotions are running high.
All right, so then the question is, was his victory a vote for him, or was it a vote against Bolsonaro? Or is that too simplistic a take?
No, I think it's hard to say, to be honest. Lula remains one of the most popular politicians in Brazilian history. And so he has always had a high level of popular support, especially in the Northeast region, in various states in the region. He had a long presidency, and for a large part of that time, Brazil was doing incredibly well. Economic growth was high. And then we saw toward the end some complications, charges of corruption against him. His predecessor was impeached. And so I think there's a lot of sort of anti-left, anti-workers' party, which is political party sentiment. And for a lot of voters, he's not the person of choice, I would say. But I think that many Brazilians understood that in this election, he represented a better future for our democracy, that he represented union, that he represented progress in a lot of ways. And even though both Bolsonaro and Lula are longstanding politicians, I think people saw Lula as being the better choice. And so, I can't necessarily say it was a vote for him or a vote against Bolsonaro. I think it was a little bit of both.
And there's still plenty of Bolsonaro allies who won. Right?
Yes.
In this, the Congress. And so he's going to have to work with sort of do you think Lula has a clear mandate? It doesn't appear that way from what I've read, but
he's mentioned a few things that he definitely wants to double down on, climate, combating deforestation in the Amazon, social justice issues, economic issues. But as you mentioned, I think that it's a tough road ahead for him because, one, the vote was incredibly close. So Lula received about 50.9% of the votes, around 60 million. And Bolsonaro received about 49.1% of the votes, so 58 million. That's a 2 million vote difference between them. And so this is a pretty divided Brazil that we're working with. But even though I think that we will see a lot of pushback from Bolsonaro supporting governors, Congress members, local leaders, Brazil's a multi-party system. And so I think he has managed to build a coalition of support from the center-left and the more moderate and center-right representatives that might help him along the way.
All right, so let's talk about all the other messed up things about Brazil's polarized society. I'm just kidding. In terms of You mentioned that you've been following disinformation, you've been following Brazilian politics, focusing on it. For the casual Latin American observer who might be into politics, who might not be as like amazingly geeky as you when it comes to Brazilian politics, and I say that as a compliment. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, it's okay. I take it as one.
Okay, so when that's like high end, that's like wizard
Oh
level.
my goodness.
How do you break down other angles for people who might be trying to make connections with American politics, or is it too simple? Or give me your thoughts.
So yes, I have been following kind of false and misleading narratives and tracking them. And as we know, disinformation is very cyclical and borderless. And so there are a lot of parallels between the right-wing movement, conservative movement in the United States and their narratives and what we've seen in Brazil. And they definitely play to each other. So we've seen Donald Trump supporting Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro echoing Donald Trump. Their base is echoing each other. And so yes, there are a lot of parallels, but as you mentioned, Brazil is its own country. I think this information in general circulates in unique ways there. But it's nothing new. We saw this a lot in 2018, even before then. And I would say, as we've mentioned here in the US, disinformation is kind of a symptom of a larger crisis of trust that we're seeing worldwide. And it kind of is born from a move away from consumption of traditional media and trust in traditional media, a move toward more like digital news consumption in places like YouTube or WhatsApp, where people might encounter more one sided communication. And for Brazilians, there's also the case of this sort of complicated political, economic history and a history of corruption. And so I think all of that exacerbates this distrust in institutions and political leaders and definitely makes the situation worse. But I would say, a lot of people I think in 2018 were worried about foreign interference in elections. I think honestly we're at a place where what we're seeing is not at scale. What we see is a lot more sort of coordinated, organic digital engagement prompted by
Yeah.
political divisions. So domestic rifts are fueling the spread of political disinformation.
And not to both sides of it, but in Brazil, is it sort of, is disinformation mostly coming from the right, or can you give any specific examples as we wrap up? Because I don't want to get into whataboutism, but at the same time, I want to understand that, at least from what I read, this campaign was pretty intense. Like, it makes American campaigns feel a little bit, I don't know, pleasant.
It was intense. I think we saw a lot of the same trends here in the US, but I think because Lula represents a farther left candidate and Bolsonaro a farther right candidate, the polarization was just very stark. But while it's hard to quantify disinformation in the sense that we can't see the larger scope of the internet, like we can't see the entire ecosystem, I would say that we do, much like in the United States, see quite a lot of false and misleading narratives coming from the far right. That's definitely the case there. It's not isolated to the right. I think we see things on both sides, but a lot of it coming from the far right. And then I would just say, I think we just need to remember that, disinformation is kind of best thought of as a problem for democracy, not for Democrats. And so, even though I think we might want to say blame one side for these false or
Yeah, no, but I think that's a point that you're saying. It's like disinformation goes beyond party affiliation. It's more about democracy with a D, right? And that's the bigger issue here, right?
Absolutely. I think when it comes to political disinformation or political propaganda, oftentimes what we're seeing is coming from the right, but I think that we're also seeing it's complicated. We're also seeing a lot of QAnon conspiracies beginning to circulate in Brazil. We're seeing a lot of health misinformation and disinformation, some nonpartisan things circulating. So I think it has a lot more to do with the way that we as a society are consuming information and news and where we go for reputable information or counterpoints, honestly.
All right. So the last thing I'm going to ask is, what did you forget to add about Brazil that people need to know? That drives you crazy. That's like, if I could educate people about Brazil in this, it would be blank.
Honestly, I think it's just important to remember that, yes, we're a young democracy, but Brazil has very strong institutions, and I think we've seen that playing out time and time again. It's a huge country. When I describe Brazil to friends, sometimes I'll say it's like five countries in one. the different regions are very different from one another. Histories are different, food, culture. And so I think it's just important to understand that, yes, it's a very complicated country. Simple headlines or simple conclusions often don't paint the full picture. And so I think when it comes to elections, we just have to make sure that we're being nuanced about our understanding and reading up as much as possible.
All right. So for all the new fans that you made after this podcast, where can the kids find you on the socials?
Oh, goodness, the kids. Well, you can find me on Twitter. So I'm at Roberta S. Braga, and annoyingly tweeting frequently in the last few months because I've been going crazy with this election. Also on LinkedIn. So absolutely feel free to connect with me there.
All right. Well, Roberta Braga, thank you for being on Latino Rebels Radio.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
There you go. Smart, nuanced conversation about Brazil in about 20-something minutes. How's that? Just want to thank Roberta again. If you like what you heard, please rate and review us. Share this podcast. Follow Latino Rebels on the socials. Follow Latino Media Collective, which is Oscar Fernandez, on the socials. Follow Fernanda Santos, our editorial director. Follow me, Julito77. Tweet at us. Instagram us. Comment at us. Rate and review us. Do all those good things. Next week, we know the midterms are coming. I'll be live blogging for MSNBC. We're also going to be doing a live Instagram on Latino Rebels Instagram with senior editor Hector Luis Alamo. And then we're going to do a little palate cleanser next week. I'm not going to reveal it, but it has to do with soccer. And then we're going to come back with some midterm analysis, post-midterm analysis when it comes to Latinos and Latinas. How's that? So we'll be back next week. And like we always do, we always close out with La Plebe en Venas Abiertas. Julio Ricardo Varela, Latino Rebels Radio. We out of here.
No hay expressed by the guests and contributors in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Futuro Media or its employees.
From PRX.